For those of you who don't know me, lots of you do, but lots of you don't too. My name is Luann Berteau. I'm a behavior analyst here with St. Lucie County Schools, and my responsibilities are generally with the autism, self-contained autism programs. I also consult and sometimes do consultations with students in the general ed population as well who also have autism. So those of you who are from Northport, you've probably seen my face, even if you don't know my name. And those of you from other schools may not have seen me before, but to let you know a little bit about myself and my background, I am a board-certified behavior analyst. I'm also a master's level educator. I have a master's degree in special education. I've worked in St. Lucie County School District for the last 3 years. Previous to that, I did in-home consultation and services for children with autism, both with a private agency. I also had my own consulting business at one point in time. For almost 10 years, I was a special educator and worked with students taught in a school very much, frankly, like Dale Casson's in the Columbus, Ohio public schools. It's very interesting what I found when I worked at that school as a teacher, and when I started teaching in although it was a school that was designed for children with severe behavior handicaps, and that was the language that was used at that point when I was teaching, probably about half the students I have in my class had a diagnosis somewhere on the autism spectrum. Now, at that point in time, nobody knew that they had an autism spectrum disorder. They were not particularly well identified 20 years ago. But looking back now at the kids that I have, I know that most of those kids, or half of those kids anyway, had issues that were specific to the autism spectrum disorder. When we talk about autism, chances are that 10 years ago you may not have even heard of autism, or if you had, it was just in a very, very general kind of way. Today it's the most widely discussed disability that is affecting children, and unfortunately it is also one of the most widely misunderstood. I want to just take a little poll before we get started. How many of you have either seen a movie or read a book about with a character with autism in it? Several? Okay. What movie? Rain Man's the biggest one. Anything else you can think of? Or books? There's several out there. They're very interesting. How many of you have heard or read about autism in the news somewhere? Almost all of us who work for the school district have heard or seen something about autism in the news. Unfortunately, a lot of what we hear may be a little bit one-sided. People in the media, frankly, their job is to get a good story, and they're going to put out information that makes for a good story. And it may not always give all the information of a situation that may have occurred. How many of you know or regularly interact with a parent of a child with autism? Several. Great. How many of you know or regularly interact with a person with autism? Many of you here at Northport, because we have 3 self-contained autism units here at this school. How many of you have a family member with an autism spectrum disorder? Several people. That includes me. I have an adult sister who has a higher functioning version of autism. She's actually 40 years old. She was not diagnosed until she was 37 because autism was not diagnosed back in the day. So when I talk about autism, I'm talking about it from my professional experience as an educator and behavior analyst, but also from my personal experience of having a family member on the autism spectrum. Now, many of the news stories that we hear about children with autism are quite sensational, and we're often left with a skewed perception of what autism is, what it looks like, and the children who are affected by it. Lack of information or misinformation can lead us to be anxious and unsure when we have to interact with persons with autism. What we hope to do today is to provide you with information and answer some of your questions about autism and give you some strategies for interacting with students on the autism spectrum. There's a few things I want to make clear right off the bat. First of all, there is no typical person with autism. Almost all of us have seen Rain Man, and for a long time there was sort of a belief that That's what autism looked like Dustin Hoffman's character in Rain Man. Very few children, frankly, that I interact with that have autism have a whole lot in common with the Rain Man character. With people on the autism spectrum, there are different degrees of impairment. Some are only mildly affected. Some are very severely affected by their autism. There are different skills and interests. There are very different behavior challenges as well. Some children we work with may be very, very active. Others may be very passive and have lower energy. Some are very loud. Some are extremely quiet. Some kids on the autism spectrum are extremely organized, whereas others are very disorganized and very distractible. These differences don't mean that a person does or doesn't have autism. It only means that the disability affects them in a different way. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what specifically autism is. Autism is a neurological disorder that affects the brain. The brains of people with autism have difficulty interpreting the sights and the sounds and the interactions, and they see the world differently from what the kind of popular term is neurotypical children, children with typical neurological systems. Several studies have shown that children with autism have enlarged brain growth very early in their life. Now, in normal brain development, the neuron connections are eliminated, unneeded neuron connections are eliminated through a process called pruning. We prune off connections in the brain that they don't need. The process refines normal brain connections and increases the efficiency of all the remaining connections in the brain. One possibility is that there is less pruning off of those unneeded connections in children that have autism. During infancy, think about this, the brain is experiencing the world and deciding how to construct itself. But in a child with autism, the brain may actually be growing too fast. And this creates abnormal connections and makes it very hard for children with autism to make sense of the world. They actually get all the information in that they need, but because that information is coming so fast, they can't figure out where to put it or what to do with it. An analogy I like to use, how many of you ever played the video game Tetris? Okay? Yep, play Tetris. It's kind of like a bunch of puzzle pieces, different shapes are dropping down from the top, and you have to fit all those pieces into the place where they belong. Now, when you first start the game, and those pieces first start coming down, they're coming down kind of slowly. So it's relatively easy to take those pieces, twist them, turn them, and fit them in where they belong. However, as the game goes on, those pieces start dropping faster and faster, and the bank of pieces at the bottom is fuller and fuller. So it gets harder and harder to twist and turn and put those pieces in the place where they belong, and at a certain point, the information, there's just too much, and it just goes, there's no place to put the information anymore. That's how that helps me think about how children, what happens with children with autism, when information is coming into them. It's coming in too fast, they can't fit it where it belongs, and this can lead to lots of different kinds of difficulties for them. We do know with autism that there is no single cause identified. There's lots of research, there's lots of possibilities, there's lots of different things that I've talked about, but no one can say definitively that this or that or something else is the cause for autism. Research findings show that there probably is a pretty strong genetic component. A lot of times we will have families, and I've worked with many who have more than one child with autism in the family. Most likely, along with the genetic components, there's environmental, immunological, and metabolic factors that influence the development of the disorder. There's been a lot of discussion in the popular media about the relationship between vaccines, childhood vaccines, and autism, but scientific research has not supported that belief. If any of you saw the Today Show, maybe just a week or two ago, there was, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the researcher on, who said very clearly that there is nothing to support the fact that vaccines cause autism. However, what often happens is that autism, as it says, typically appears by age 3. A lot of children start to develop, or we start to see the signs of autism at about the same age that vaccines are given. So it's not surprising that people would start to make that connection. Whatever the cause of autism is, and frankly, and we don't have the information, we don't have any kind of definitive answer of that. Even if we don't know the cause, there are many, many things we can do to help students with autism learn and be successful, and that's really what we want to focus on today. Kids with autism exhibit serious impairment in all three of these areas. First of all, communication. Now, people think of communication simply as, oh, maybe they can't talk or can't speak. That's not necessarily the case. There are two kinds of communication. Expressive communication, which is being able to put information out to others, to be able to, and it may be speech, it may be able to just how we communicate our wants and needs. There's also receptive communication, and that's how we take information in, understanding what other people tell us or show us and being able to work off of that. Kids on the autism spectrum have difficulty in both of those areas. Now, for kids who are more severely impaired, that may mean they have no speech, don't understand hardly any directions at all. For kids who are on the higher end of the spectrum, they may actually have pretty good speech and be able to, tell you some things, but they have trouble with multi-step directions when we're getting lots of information instead of just little pieces. Or they may have difficulty with, although they may be able to express their wants and needs when they're calm. When they start to get stressed, they have a hard time expressing their wants and needs. Doesn't mean they don't have an autism spectrum disorder, just means that they're on the higher end of the spectrum. The other area they can have difficulty in is social interaction. In fact, all kids, I don't care how high functioning they are on the autism spectrum, have difficulty with social interactions. And frankly, that's really one of the most impairing difficulties of autism, is difficulties with social interaction. And there's reasons for that. Because so many kids on the autism, and we always have to come back to that neurological component. Remember all this information that's coming in and kids trying to figure out what to do with this information. Children with autism can be so busy attending to all the other things in the environment, the sights, the sounds, the noise, the movement around them, that they don't catch on to social cues. They don't see interaction with people as something more important or something that they should focus on more than other things, because their brains don't allow them necessarily to see that until they're taught how. Finally, the final area where we see a lot of difficulty with kids on the spectrum, and this sounds really complicated, it's really not, restrictive, repetitive, stereotype patterns of behavior, interests, and activities. What the heck does that mean? Well, basically, what it means is the kids on the autism spectrum tend to have a limited repertoire of behaviors. They tend to repeat the same behaviors over and over, and sometimes they're kind of unusual behaviors. So some of the behaviors, repetitive, stereotype behaviors you may see, may be things like hand flapping, like tapping on things, maybe little movement rituals that they may have. They may have stereotyped interests. I've worked with children who've had a very intensive concentration. Say I have one vacuum cleaners. Kid loves vacuum cleaners. He's fascinated by them. He wants to talk about them, take them apart, put them together, collect them. There's nothing wrong with having an interest in vacuum cleaners. He may be a great mechanic or an engineer someday. But if that's all you can focus on, if that's your only interest, then it starts to become a problem. The other area where they'll have a limited repertoire is of activities. You'll see many kids on the spectrum will tend to have repetitive activities like, say, rolling things downstairs, or lining things up, or maybe just repeating the same physical motions over and over again. Swinging may be one. Now, there's nothing wrong with swinging, obviously. It's a very good and appropriate activity for a kid who is, grade school or middle school age. But if that's the only thing that you can do and the only thing that you have interest with, then it begins to cause you a problem. Let's talk about what autism is not. And this is very important. Autism is not a psychosis. It's not a mental illness. It's not the same as schizophrenia or multiple personality disorders or any of those kind of things. Now, how many of you have seen the movie A Beautiful Mind? Now, a lot of people have seen that and have come to me and said, oh, well, the character in that movie had autism. And frankly, for the first little bit that I watched that movie, I might have thought he had autism as well, because he had a lot of the stereotyped interests and poor social interactions and those kind of things. However, there's a very important difference. The character in that movie had a disconnect with reality. What you would see him doing after a while with the roommate, with the little child, he was imagining that people were there who were not there. He was not connected with reality. And that's part of what happens with the psychosis. Now, people with autism don't have that issue. Now, sometimes people will hear kids or adults with autism, and they will be talking, and it sounds like they're talking to somebody who's not there. And I've had clinicians look at that and say, oh, I think this kid has schizophrenia because he's imagining someone there that's not. With kids with autism, frequently what they're doing when we see that is they're scripting something that they've heard. They're scripting like a favorite TV show or a conversation that they've heard from somebody else. That's not the same thing as thinking somebody is there who's not. They don't think there's actually somebody else there. They do that, it's almost like a self-stimulatory behavior. It helps calm them or stimulate them when they're feeling stressed or when they're feeling bored. So they'll engage in that kind of behavior. But they don't think someone is there who's not. So it's not a disconnect with reality with kids with autism. Autism is also not a person without feelings or emotions. Some kids with autism do not react. We talked about they have social difficulties. They may not react to social situations in the same way as neurotypical people. They may tend, maybe if they accidentally hurt somebody, or if they get hurt, they may not cry, or you may not see them showing remorse or things like that. It doesn't mean that they don't have feelings. It just means, once again, they're not necessarily attending to those social cues any more than anything else in the environment. Some of them will have very delayed reactions to situations when they come up. But they definitely have the feelings and emotions of other people. They may just not express them in the same ways. And finally, autism, and this is just such an important thing to take away today, autism is not a result of poor parenting. Many, many years ago, when they first started to diagnose autism, there were lots of theories about, oh, well, the kid has autism because they weren't loved or nurtured or those kind of things. And that's absolute nonsense. Not true. Kids do not have autism because of the way that they were parented. And parenting has nothing to do with the kid having autism. Now, that being said, does that mean that every kid who has autism is being parented well? Of course not. No more than it does with any child. That we can't say that all children of any kind are necessarily being well parented. But parenting problems do not cause autism. I think it's also very, very important to remember. I've seen, unfortunately, hear people sometimes talking about kids on the spectrum and say, oh, if their parent would only do this, if their parent would only do that. I think it's very important to remember that it is extremely stressful to parent a child with any disability, and maybe autism even more so than some other disabilities because of the constant need for supervision and some of the difficult behaviors. Those of us who see or work with children with autism, we get to go home at the end of the day. And then we get, our 12 hours or whatever to recuperate before we have to come back to de-stress, before we have to come back and work with the children again. People who have parents of children with autism are with their children all the time. They're up with them in the middle of the night. They're dealing with behaviors in stores and on weekends, and it's very stressful. Behaviors that occur sometimes can be very embarrassing and very exhausting. And I think it's always important when we're talking to parents with autism to remember how difficult that is and cut them a little bit of slack. Many years ago, I was working with a parent who she had a wonderful little boy, but he was very deeply affected by his autism. And I remember getting frustrated with her because of if she'd just do this, if she'd do some of these things that we're talking about, and it would just be so helpful. And why doesn't she step up to the plate more? And I remember one time talking to this parent about something that her child needed and saying to her, I could probably find that for you if that would be helpful. The parent burst into tears. And it wasn't that she didn't care about her child and didn't want to support her child, but she was so overwhelmed and so burnt out that there was nothing left. And just the fact that somebody actually offered something to her to help her out, the emotions just came pouring through. So if you can think about that and remember that when we're working with parents of children with autism or with any kind of exceptionality, the stress and the difficulty of parenting a child with some of those difficulties, and try not to be judgmental based on that. Students with autism spectrum disorders range from, as we said, very minor impairments to very, very extreme impairments. They will have uneven skill development, not just in academic skills, but also in social skills, communication skills, and self-care skills as well. We have many kids on the spectrum who can read any word that you put in front of them. But if you ask them a question about comprehension, they won't be able to do it. We have kids that may have excellent skills in being able to, manipulate items and work locks and all those kind of things. But then there may be other physical skills that they have great trouble with. So we can't just assume their abilities or disabilities because they have autism. And finally, many kids on the spectrum also have coexisting disorders. Many of the kids we work with also have seizure disorders. Some have mental retardation. Fragile X syndrome is actually a genetically based form of mental retardation. About 25% of kids with Fragile X syndrome also have signs of autism. Affective disorders such as anxiety disorders, mood disorders, depression. We'll see a lot of kids who have symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder as well. So, and these kind of things, because they're not uncommon, they can make the autism add even more difficulty to trying to deal with the autism effectively. Prevalence of autism in the United States, about 1 out of every 150 births is a child on the autism spectrum. And the rate of diagnosis is increasing by 10 to 17% every year. That's amazing. A lot of people will ask the questions like, well, is it really increasing or is just the diagnosis of autism increasing? Frankly, it's probably a little of both. Any of us who have been educators for many years know that there are kind of popular disabilities that occur over time. However, and I do see some children who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder where, and I'm not a diagnostician, but where I might say, I don't know that that's the appropriate diagnosis for them. However, for every child for where that may be an inappropriate diagnosis, there's about 10 more for which it definitely is an appropriate diagnosis. So by and large, the kids are being diagnosed appropriately with autism. And one thing that's very interesting is that autism is 4 times more prevalent in boys than it is in girls. Now, in St. Lucie County, to talk a little bit about autism in our community, we have nearly 200 students enrolled in the St. Lucie County schools who have an autism spectrum disorder. When I originally made this slide in July, it was 178. But every week, there's about 1 or 2 new children that are being identified in the county as having autism spectrum disorders. Some of these are coming in from pre-K and are being identified that way. A lot are moving in from out of county. We have a lot of people coming up from Palm Beach or Miami areas and things like that that are moving into our district that have autism spectrum disorders. As far as how the demographics lay out in St. Lucie County, about 85% of the kids in our district that have autism spectrum disorders are boys. This is even higher than the national average. 59% of the kids are in pre-K or elementary school. And then about the other half, or somewhat less than half, are in middle school or high school. Now, what's very interesting is we may have that concentration now in the lower grades, but the higher grades are going to have to get ready because the kids are coming. And less than half of the students who have autism spectrum disorders in our county are served in the autism cluster units. And that is as it should be. When we have the autism spectrum, the autism cluster units, the self-contained units, are saved for the children who have more severe impairments, whose communication, behavior, social interaction is severely impaired. There are many kids on the autism spectrum who whose academic skills are in the normal or very close to normal range. There are kids who, as far as their communication, is actually pretty good. And it would be a disservice to those children for them to be in the autism spectrum, in the autism cluster units. Now, just to talk a little bit about, just because a child comes into the district or is identified with an autism spectrum disorder, we want to just, Mr. Thomas has asked me to go over with everybody to make clear that that does not automatically assume that they are going to be placed in an autism unit. There's actually a multi-step procedure, and I'm not going to go over this with you step by step today, but basically there are 4 places that any kind of referral for an ESE program, including autism, have to go before a child would be placed in a self-contained unit. It's not a simple process for the very reason that we want to try to develop and implement the supports that a student needs in the least restrictive environment possible. School guidance counselors or ESE chairs will have the manual of the detailed chart of the referral process, but this is a not quite so simple summary. And basically there are 4 basic steps of intervention that the school must go for before a referral for placement is made. First is collaborative intervention and development that is developed in collaborative intervention that is developed with the parent. The teacher-parent develops interventions and tries those out. If those don't work, next it goes to the grade level team. The teacher tries to work out interventions to work with the child at the grade level team. They have to collect data, look at that process. If that is not successful, it goes to the next step, which is collaborative interventions developed and implemented through the SST, we're starting to call it PSI, problem-solving team process. Now, so then those interventions are tried, data is collected. If that doesn't work, we come back to the SST/PSI one more time. The important things to note with these is the data must be collected on intervention success every step of the way. And schools are encouraged to consult with the school behavior analyst at any point in the intervention process. Once the SST process begins, however, the behavior analyst should be contacted and invited to participate. Let's talk a little bit about inclusion. Now, there are actually, and when we talk about inclusion, I want to be very, very clear about this. As we talk about inclusion, it's important to note that any inclusion must include proper supports and accommodations for kids on the spectrum. If you know a child is not a skilled swimmer, you don't just pick them up and throw them into the deep water with all the other kids who know how to swim and expect them to be able to swim. What we want to do is you go into the water with them, you hold them up, you give them water wings, you gradually remove these supports as they gain skills and get confidence. To do otherwise dooms the non-swimmer, and it also isn't fair. It's an upsetting situation for all the other kids in the pool who have to watch that swimmer go down. So supported inclusion is very beneficial for students with autism because it provides them with positive role models from whom they can learn appropriate behavior. Children with autism are often highly imitative. And they say what they hear, they do what they see. If their models, their role models, are only other children like themselves, then it's very likely that their behavior patterns will continue to be highly restricted. However, if they have some more typical models, they will have the opportunity to imitate and to integrate those more functional behaviors into their repertoire. Now, supported inclusion of students with autism and other exceptionalities can also be a very positive experience for the neurotypical children. Students who might otherwise lack confidence and self-esteem can come out of their shells when they have the opportunity to be a special helper or a peer buddy to a child with some kind of exceptionality. And with appropriate support and guidance, students who might otherwise tend to be bullies or tend to shun persons who are different from themselves can learn to overcome the fears and anxieties they have that tend to lead to those kind of behaviors. Any questions or comments before I go on? Okay. Let's talk about some of the common autism spectrum disorders that we will see in it. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a wide range of disorders that fit under the category of ASDs, or autism spectrum disorders. Full autism, classic autism, is actually not very common. We don't see a whole lot of kids who have classic autism, but they will have one of these or often have some of these variations. Frequently, and most often in the general ed population, we will see kids who are diagnosed with Asperger's disorder. Now, Asperger's disorder kids tend to be near at, or even above grade level in their academic functioning, and their communication may not be bad at all. However, their primary impairment is in their social behaviors or their social communication. They have a very hard time interacting and getting along with other kids. A lot of times they are more interested in adults than they are in children. As adolescents, Asperger's disorder can be extremely excruciating. Kids can have an awful, awful time fitting in, and they can often be the targets of bullying, particularly once they get into adolescence. Another autism spectrum disorder that we may see is Rett syndrome. And Rett syndrome, it may not be all that common, but it's actually very interesting because it's one of the few autism disorders that primarily affects females. It's a genetic disorder. And actually, usually the kids with Rett syndrome are severely or profoundly impaired. They also have extreme difficulty with motor skills and will lose skills over time. And finally, probably the most common diagnosis we see in our autism cluster units and also among some kids in the general ed population is PDD and OS, which actually stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder, not otherwise specified. This is basically called atypical autism. And by that I mean to be diagnosed with autism, there is a checklist of symptoms and the kids have to meet so many of them to get a diagnosis of autism. Kids with PDD and OS generally just don't meet all of the criteria with autism. Several of them, but not all of them, which gives them the PDD and OS symptom. A lot of times kids with PDD and OS have a later onset of their autism, or their symptoms are just a little bit different, or like I said, are just not quite as severe enough to get an autism diagnosis. Now let's talk about common characteristics of autism spectrum disorders. Not every child on the spectrum will have every one of these characteristics, and how a characteristic shows itself may actually vary from child to child. It's not going to look the same in everybody. But here are some of the common ones that we'll see. First of all is self-stimulatory behaviors. A lot of you have probably seen them. We'll see things like hand flapping, as we talked about, maybe tapping on items. Maybe kids will move about, get up and have to walk or move in a regular thing. Another thing that we may see with self-stimulatory behaviors is what we call sighting, where a child will look at something, or they'll seem to be kind of focused on an item or an object sort of out in the distance there. That's also, it's a harder to pinpoint, but also self-stimulatory behavior. Now, self-stim behaviors, think about it. We all have little, probably self-stim kind of things we do. For kids with autism, self-stim behaviors are a form of self-regulation. They tend to do them either when they are anxious and overwhelmed, or when they are bored and not engaged. And they help them sort of modulate or get themselves at a nice even keel kind of level. And if you think about it, we all have little self-stim behaviors that we may do to help ourselves when we are anxious or when we're bored. Maybe we shake our leg or tap our foot when we're trying to sit still. Maybe we twirl our hair. Maybe, I don't know, I'm sure that who else can give me an example of a self-stim behavior that they may do to help calm themselves?
Bite your nails.
Bite your lip, bite your nails. Yep, those are all good things. Now, the difference is because with a typically functioning person, we are socially self-aware. We know how these behaviors look. So we can pick things that are small and kind of minor that other people aren't going to notice. However, with kids with autism, because they have difficulty with social awareness, they'll be doing some of these things that look really odd and that are off-putting to other people. If we try to just stop a self-stimulatory behavior, that's probably going to be a problem because a kid needs something to help regulate themselves. What we want to do is teach them more appropriate self-stimulatory behaviors. I worked many years ago with a little boy who he hit himself, and that was really a self-stim for him. He could sit and just hit himself as hard as he could in the stomach. Now, it didn't hurt him, but it really upset other people around him. And they would either be scared of him that he might hurt somebody else, hit somebody else like that, or scared that he was going to hurt himself. Now, what we were able to do with that child, he needed to be able to regulate himself in some way. We taught him a replacement behavior by that, and over time, he learned to just kind of put his hand on his stomach and just kind of push, like that. Now, that didn't scare or upset anybody. It still helped him calm himself down. So we were able to give him a way of calming himself that was not, socially upsetting or inappropriate to other people. Echolalia, or unusual speech patterns, is also very common with kids on the autism spectrum. Now, many of the kids, in its most classic sense, echolalia is just repeating a word or phrase. So if you say sit down to a child, the child may just continue to say sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down. For some kids, it's more interesting because they will do what is called a scripting, where they will repeat whole phrases, conversations. They may do the whole dialogue from the episode of The Little Mermaid they saw the day before. I used to work with a little boy who, every single day, he would come in and repeat verbatim the argument that his parents had the night before, including all the colorful words that they used as well. We were always very careful what we said around that child because we knew it was likely to be repeated. And finally, they also may have kind of a odd prosody or tone or intonation to their speech. The words may go up and down, the tone. A lot of times some of these kids have what we call sort of a little professor way of talking. Their speech tone is kind of unusual. Another thing that we may often see with kids is aloofness from others. A lot of kids with autism have difficulty making eye contact and or interacting with other people. This doesn't mean that they're ignoring you. There's a whole lot of kids with autism who may never look at you and actually hear everything that you're saying to them. For a lot of kids with autism, making eye contact is very overstimulating to them, so they avoid doing it. And we have to remember, once again, that there's a neurological component to autism. The brain is not able to process all the stimuli that's coming in very effectively. So the child cannot necessarily concentrate on critical stimuli. Your talking to them doesn't seem any more important than the noise of the fan or the flashing of the lights or the people walking by in the hallway. They have a hard time focusing in. Doesn't mean they don't care, just that there's so many other things competing for their attention. Insistence on sameness. A lot of kids that we work with have a hard time with change. And if you think about it, all of us have routines that we have to follow that helps us feel more safe and comfortable during the day. For me, every morning I get up, I take my shower, I eat my breakfast. On the way to work, I stop and get a Diet Coke. Now, if for some reason I'm running late and I can't get that Diet Coke on the way to work, it screws up my whole day. And it's not just the caffeine, because honestly, sometimes I drink it without caffeine. But when I do that, when something in my routine gets thrown off, suddenly I'm making wrong turns to places I go all the time. I forget my notes, or I don't know where my pen is, or something like that. So we all have routines that help us feel more organized and calm. Now, for kids on the autism spectrum who already are feeling so bombarded with information and trying to process things and trying to calm themselves, because of their processing difficulties and overstimulation, they have even more of a need than the neurotypical person, so they rely more heavily on repetition and routine than we do. Another thing that we see with kids on the spectrum is difficulty expressing their needs. And this does not apply only to nonverbal children on the autism spectrum. Many kids on the spectrum can tell you their colors, letters, numbers, provide you with concrete information. We've had kids that can tell you every state capital, every president since George Washington. But abstract concepts are much, much harder for them. They may not be able to put together their thoughts and words to tell you that they are hungry, or that they're sick, or that they need to go to the bathroom, or that mom yelled at them this morning. And this frequently leads to the next characteristic, which is outburst. Now, this is outburst for no apparent reason. There is always a reason. However, that reason may not be apparent to us as observers. Maybe the child is overwhelmed by the stimulation in the environment. Maybe they're hungry or sick or tired. If they don't have the language to tell us, they can learn early on that they can get their point across by acting out. And if these behaviors, if we don't address them early, can become so ingrained that it's very hard to eliminate them. So that's one of the most important things with kids with autism is not only early identification of the autism spectrum disorder, but early intervention. The sooner we can identify kids with difficulties and work with them, the more likely they are to be successful. Other common characteristics. Many kids on the spectrum are very sensitive to touch. Now, that may mean that they avoid touch, don't want to be touched, can't stand being touched, or it may mean that they seek out touch and physical stimulation compulsively. For some kids, certain fabrics and textures may bother them, may just drive them crazy. Touch preferences for kids on the autism spectrum may range from very light. I work with many kids who just like very soft, almost sort of tickling kind of touch. That's okay with them. And there are others who like very hard and deep pressure. Now, there are many kids that we work with who don't know their own strength, and they're really unable to judge the intensity of their physical contact. And their attempts to play with other people may actually come across as physical attacks. I work with one young lady who will come up and just, smack somebody in the back or bulldoze right into them. And she's not trying to hurt anybody. She's trying to play. She wants attention. But she does not get the fact, because it doesn't bother her, she doesn't get the fact that that kind of contact with other people can hurt them. And when we have a child like that, we need to teach them the difference. But it's not because they're trying to hurt. Non-responsive to auditory cues. If you take one thing away from this workshop today, I hope this is the thing that you will remember. Most children on the autism spectrum are visual learners. They learn from what they hear, or from what they see, much better from what they hear. Now think about that. How do we tend to convey information to kids? How do we give them directions? Verbally. That's auditory input. Kids with autism have difficulty with auditory input. Kids with the autism spectrum are easily overstimulated by noise, and our talking to them can become just one more noise added to the environment. So with some children, the more we talk, the louder we talk, the more we repeat ourselves, the more confused or overstimulated we become. And a lot of times, it's so frequent, we'll see kids who will say, Johnny, sit down. Johnny doesn't sit down. What do we do? Johnny, sit down. I need you to sit down, Johnny. Johnny, come over here and sit down now. Oh my gosh. To a kid on the spectrum who has difficulty with that kind of information, repeating ourselves and continuing to speak will only cause more difficulties. So we really need to think clearly about how we're giving information to kids on the spectrum. Inability to focus is another difficulty kids we have. Once again, we have to go back to the fact that autism is a neurological disorder that affects the processing of information for kids. You and I may find it hard to focus on what's going on if our surroundings are hot or noisy, or if there's a lot of movement or things going on. And we don't have autism spectrum disorders. However, imagine how much more difficult it would be if your brain would not allow you to ignore distractions or even seem to magnify those distractions. For children with autism, once again, the noise from the fan on the computer may be extremely loud. Fluorescent lights, the little kind of shaky thing, the little kind of flashy thing they do, that can be completely distracting for them. So we have to really keep that in mind. Another common characteristic we'll see is uneven, gross, and fine motor development. We'll have lots of kids who may have really, really good fine motor skills, can climb anything, slide down anything, can run and play and catch the ball and everything with the best of them. However, they have extreme difficulty holding a pencil correctly, or being able to paint, or even just using both hands to hold or to open or close something. And so we can't just assume because they have good motor development in one area that will also be good in the other. And finally, unusual play. Children with autism often prefer to play alone. And when they play, it's often in a very scripted and repetitive fashion. And a lot of times they're very resistant to changing their play patterns. So you may have a kid who, when they play with the blocks, instead of building things with the blocks, will line the blocks up and line the blocks up. Or you may have a child who likes, as I mentioned before, likes to swing. Well, there's nothing wrong with swinging, but if she has to stop swinging, she'll have a major behavioral meltdown. Now that's a difficulty. We have to be able to teach kids not only academic skills, but appropriate social skills and skills for interacting with other people. Let's talk about some of, when we're interacting with kids with autism, some things that can be helpful. First of all, we have to think about our expectations. As I have gone through with you, there is no typical child with autism. Because they have a lot of splinter skills, because they may be very high in some areas and very low in other areas, we have to learn about the student and his or her abilities. We can't assume what they can do or can't do based on the fact that they have autism. And we need to set realistic expectations. We need to do everything we can to find out about the kids from their parents, from the teachers who have worked with them in the past, from the teachers who are working with them currently. Find out what it is they can and can't do, and then set our expectations based on that. It has to be based on the individual child. Interacting with students with autism. Let's talk about when we need to give kids with autism directions. One of the first things we need to do is speak in a calm but firm voice. Now we need to show kids with autism, they need to see that we are in control of the situation and also in control of ourselves. If we are getting loud and emotional and negative in the way we're giving verbal directions, something will happen with kids with autism. Now with the typical kid, or think of yourself, if somebody yells at you, or when you were a little kid, if somebody yelled at you or got loud with you, how did you tend to react? Anybody?
Same way. Go back the same way.
You come back the same way? Think about kids in your classroom. A lot of times kids, neurotypical kids, when somebody gets loud with them, they tend to do the opposite. Yes, shut down. We tend to balance out. So if somebody else is getting very loud and stressed and things like this, the tendency may be, and what we expect kids to do, is to calm down and respond to that. With kids on the autism spectrum, you may get exactly the opposite. They have a tendency to imitate what they see. They tend to get overstimulated by noise and by emotional reactions. So we have to try to keep ourselves very calm and very direct when we are giving them directions. Keep directions short and to the point. As we talked about, too much verbal input can actually can end up having the opposite effect of what we want it to do. So if you're telling Johnny to sit down, instead of saying, Johnny, I really need you to come over here and sit down for me right now. Do you mind? Woo! That's a lot of words, a lot of input. What do we focus on? Keep directions short and to the point. Johnny, sit down, please. Avoid using a loud or emotional tone of voice, which I just kind of talked about. The louder we get, the more emotional we get, the more the kids are likely to imitate that and escalate right along with us. And we want to avoid that if there's any way we can. Avoid abrupt movements or unnecessary touching, especially if the kid is stressed. Doing a lot of touching or physical pulling or pushing or things like that may actually, especially since a lot of kids on the spectrum are sensitive to touch, it may escalate them more. So we want to try to keep that as low-key as possible. Limit your use of questions. Something I see, and this is true with typical kids as well as with kids on the spectrum, a lot of times I will see people say, Johnny, do you want to sit down? What do you get? No, exactly. So if we're asking a question, we want to make sure if we're giving a direction, we're actually giving a direction. And also, if we're seeing a kid, it's just like, oh, Johnny, what's the matter? What do you want to do now? If we're asking a lot of questions, kids on the autism spectrum often have a lot of difficulty processing questions, and especially if they're upset. So we want to try to avoid that when we're giving directions. And finally, we want to model what the students want to do. Remember that they're visual learners. So if you want Johnny to sit down, not only to say, Johnny, sit down, but maybe you have a chair right next to him and say, Johnny, sit down. And you sit down as well. If you're modeling what they want them to do, they have a visual cue to go along with the verbal cues that you're giving, and that can help them process the information better. Yes?
This is in terms of behavior, you're saying no questions, but as far as teaching, we're open-ended teachers. I mean, isn't that we're taught to ask open-ended questions? Isn't that not appropriate for teaching?
It can be. It can. What we need to do with kids with autism, though, when we're teaching them skills, we need to teach them to answer the open-ended questions. Sometimes that will be a very difficult skill for them, and we need to teach that directly. We can expect that they will have difficulty with that starting out. So I think that's part of setting the expectation. If we know a kid has a difficulty with that particular skill, it's something we may need to work on them with more closely. It may be something that we pull in the ESE teacher or somebody else to work with on them as well, because it's not a skill that is likely to come naturally to them. It has to be specifically addressed. That's a very good question. Let's talk about how we can address some of the challenges. We talked about all the different things that may affect kids on the spectrum. How can we address some of those challenges? First of all, let's talk about the classroom environment. It's very hard in schools, particularly older schools, because a lot of the things that are in classrooms and the way classrooms are built are the direct opposite of what kids with autism need in the physical environment. And so we can't change everything, but let's talk about some of the things that we may be able to change and alter to help a child with autism be more successful in the classroom. First of all, and this is something frankly everybody can do, is reduce clutter. I hear laughter out there. Okay, well, it may not be the easiest thing to do, but it's something we maybe have a little more control over. Remember, the kids on the autism spectrum tend to be visual learners. So the more that's going on in their visual environment, the harder it's going to be for them to process what is important and figure out what's important to them. Reducing clutter can be as simple as making sure there's just not a lot of extraneous piles of things around. It can also be looking at walls, bulletin boards, and those kind of things. It's pretty interesting, especially as elementary school teachers. We want to make our classrooms welcoming and warm and exciting for our kids, and put all these posters and visuals and things all over the walls, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, for some kids with autism, they may find that so distracting that it makes it hard for them to attend. Does that mean you should have nothing on your walls? No. But it does mean maybe consider what needs to be there, what doesn't need to be there, or if you're working with a child with autism, maybe having their particular area a little more clear than you do the other areas of the classroom. Another thing that's helpful in reducing clutter is when we're talking about the individual child's desk or work area. For some kids, it's just fine to have multiple tasks or multiple items on the table or the desk as they're working. For kids with autism, that doesn't tend to work. The more stuff that's out there, the more distracted they get. So trying to keep just what they need in their particular environment is going to be really helpful. And it's interesting because I'm looking down here right now. We have a lovely fall tablecloth on the table right now. And it's very pretty, and I like it a whole lot. However, if you have a kid with autism who's visually overstimulated, and you put his work over that, he may be paying all this attention to the leaves and the colors and the different shapes on theirs rather than to his work. I worked with a kid many years ago, a pretty high verbal kid, but he definitely, just everything caught his attention. One time I was walking down the hall with him, and I'm wearing a patterned skirt with different colors on it. And he's looking at my skirt as we're walking. He keeps looking at my skirt, and I ask him, Luke, do you like my skirt? And he looks up at me and says, it hurts my eyes. Luckily, he was able to communicate himself well. But it would have never occurred to me that the pattern in my skirt, but it really did. It was distracting him from what he needed to do, which was walk down the hall, pay attention to where he's going. So we always need to think about those things when we're working with kids on the spectrum. Natural lighting. Well, it tends to be helpful with kids with autism, but almost every school classroom in the world, what kind of lighting do we have? Fluorescent. Fluorescent lights have this constant little flash that goes on with them. And for kids on the autism spectrum, that little flash can be like a strobe light going off. So what can we do about that? Well, we probably can't change the lighting in our classrooms. But what we can do sometimes is maybe turn those lights off, at least in the area immediately next to the kid with autism. Maybe we can take more advantage of natural lighting, with our shades up if we have windows in our classroom. Or at least be able to give kids a break to an area where there is more natural lighting to help them, calm themselves down if the fluorescent lighting gets overstimulating on them. Seating students away from distracting items is also important. Once again, the more things in their area, the more there is going on, the more likely they are to have difficulty focusing. Sometimes we can move items, sometimes we can't. Sometimes we just have to look at maybe covering them. I worked with a little boy some time ago, and they say, oh, he won't focus during group time. He just, when he's sitting at his table doing group work, we have to constantly redirect him, and he just won't get his tasks done. And when I walked in the classroom to observe him, what I saw was that the classroom computers were right next to his table. And the little screensaver was going, back and forth and making all this noise. Well, of course, he was so busy and so distracted by the computer, he wasn't focusing on work. Well, and I was told, well, you know, we don't have any place else to sit them. We can't move the computers. What are we supposed to do? You might throw a sheet over them. You know, you might do something to cover the computers or put something in front of the computers so it's not so distracting. I've also worked with many classrooms where maybe there's a circle time or something and there's a bookshelf next to the circle and kids are constantly trying to get up or get something off the bookshelf or even just, you know, looking at the bookshelf and the items on it. Putting some kind of cover over that so they're more able to focus can be a very helpful strategy and you know, not necessarily not a very difficult thing to do. Another thing is reducing extraneous noise. And that can be very hard to do in a school because we have loudspeakers going off, bells ringing, kids transitioning through the halls, all sorts of different things going on. But if we think about it, we may find some ways to be able to reduce this just a little bit. Maybe part of that, once again, is just reducing how much verbal we're giving to the kids, how much we're talking to them. Maybe part of that is for kids who have difficulty with noise, and we have a lot of kids who have difficulty getting to and from buses or in the lunchroom or things like that. Having them transition before or after the other kids when it's not quite so noisy. For some kids, we'll provide them with earphones or with sometimes with little ear things you put in your ears to reduce sound, so they're a little less sensitive to that. But anything that we can do, maybe it's as simple as I worked with a kid years ago who, the sound of a fan. I mean, if a fan was running in the classroom, he was not going to focus on anything in that fan, so it's moving the fan further away from him, or moving that child away from the loudspeaker, or away from the door where all the noise coming back and forth. And sometimes it's about moving the kid further up in the classroom. I've worked with students on the spectrum. They set the student in the back of the class, and this is pretty frequent, frankly, if you've got a kid who maybe is being included for a certain subject, and they have an aide or a helper who's coming with them. And there's a tendency to set that child in the back of the class so the aide can help them without distracting the other child. However, what can happen is if the teacher is teaching up front and the child is back here in the back, there's all this noise, activity, things that are going on between that child and the teacher. And the kid may have a very difficult time focusing because of all the other distractions in between. So sometimes if you can have a child sitting closer to the front, closer to the instruction or the board that they need to look at, maybe off to the side a little bit if there's an aide or somebody who's working with them, but have them closer to the instruction and the material that they need to listen to or hear can be very helpful. Other things that we can do to address challenges, and challenges in communication. And once again, this is maybe one of the toughest areas for kids on the spectrum is communication. So what can we do to help kids with communication difficulties? First of all, make our verbal directions short and direct. Say very clearly what it is we want them to do, one time without a lot of extra information, like I was telling you before. Use concrete language. We want kids with autism to learn about abstract concepts like feelings and things like that, but when we're giving directions is not the time to try to teach that. We'll teach that in instructional time, but not when we're trying to communicate something specifically with them. We want to use concrete concepts because that is what kids with autism tend to understand the best. We want to try, another thing we can do is pair verbal cues. Whenever we're giving that auditory information, we want to pair it with visual input as well. Now that can take lots of different forms. The visual input may be in the forms of using pictures. Those of you who work with kids with autism or have been around, you may see things, what we call PETs, little picture cards that can be used to help give better information for directions, to make it more concrete for them. That we can, so if we're telling a child to sit down and we hold up a picture of a child sitting down at the same time we say that, that is a visual thing that we can do to support that direction. We can also use gestural cues as prompts. So if we're telling a child to sit down, we say sit down and we gesture to the chair at the same time. That gives them a visual as well as an auditory cue to help them follow through. And finally, a sign can be something we can use for kids who know sign. It can be helpful to give them sign language cue as well. Now, if a kid doesn't know sign, we'll need to teach them sign before they're able to do that. But once again, that is a visual that can reinforce the direction that we give. Another thing we can do for kids that have difficulties with communication is implement visual schedules. We'll take a little break here in a while, and I'll bring in a visual schedule to try to show you an example of a visual schedule. But if we think about it, sometimes people say visual. Why do we need a visual schedule? Well, how many of you have planners or calendars that you use to help keep you organized and get you through the day? I wouldn't know where to go if I didn't have my planner with me. A visual schedule is just a version of an organizer for a child to help them learn how to get through and manage their day. And if we're using visual schedules that show either in pictures or for higher functioning kids with words, what we do, what comes next, what comes next, what comes next, that can help the child feel more secure and more organized and understand their day. If we're just telling them, okay, we're going to go to gym and then we're going to go to lunch and recess, and after that we have speech, a lot of words, a lot of information, they're probably not going to get it all. Using a visual schedule can help them integrate that information better. Gestural or physical prompts. Like I was saying before, if you're giving a kid a direction, to be able to just, point or gesture or give them some kind of a clue of what it is that you want them to do. Physical prompts, for some kids, they be very sensitive to touch, but with many of our kids, we can give them some kind of little physical prompt, whether it's a touch on the back or kind of a touch on the shoulder or, a slight little, push, for lack of a better word, in the right direction when we need them to go somewhere. But we always want to use the least intrusive prompt that we can. If we can do it with a point, we don't want to touch. If we can do it, with a gesture, then we don't necessarily need to physically lead or pull kids, to where we want them to go. Another thing that's very helpful is writing rules and instructions for students who can read. It doesn't always have to be pictures. If we have kids whose academic functioning is pretty good, we can write down what it is we want them to do. I can think of an example of a student who was getting a direction and was having a very hard time following it. And I believe the direction was to wash her hands. And she was being told, wash your hands. Nope, not going to wash my hands. Wash your hands. And she starts repeating, she starts echoing, wash my hands, wash my hands. And wash your hands, please. I'm going to get in trouble. She's not doing it. In fact, what she's actually doing is she's stimming off the verbal direction that she's getting. So let's try something. Took a piece of paper, wrote down on the piece of paper, this was a student who could read quite well, wrote down on the paper, wash your hands. Without saying a word, walked over to the student, placed the piece of paper on the table in front of her. She looked down at it and said, wash your hands. Walked straight into the bathroom and washed her hands. Giving that visual or even, like I said, written support of that, can be very helpful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's giving a visual cue. Secondly, and this is true for typically functioning children as well, if someone's telling you something, you can argue with them. Can you argue with something written on a piece of paper? Can't argue with a piece of paper. So that can be, like I said, with higher functioning students, can be a very effective strategy. Okay, let's talk about, and like I said, after we take a break, and we'll do this in just about 5 minutes, some of the things. One of the most important strategies, and I really wanted to spend a lot of time on this, is visual strategies we can use for children with autism. Because there tend to be visual. How many of you have ever heard or seen an interview or read anything about Temple Grandin? Anybody? Temple Grandin is a woman, an adult woman with autism. And she is a person with very high functioning skills. And she has her own business, actually, where she developed an agricultural business for figuring out how to move cattle through a gated system for when they're being taken to slaughter. Now, she figured out a way to do this where the cattle will move calmly, slowly, and compliantly without a lot of difficulty and risk of the cattle getting hurt or the people getting hurt or any of that kind of stress and strain. Now, but Temple Grandin is also a person with autism and has had a lot of difficulty in her life with social situations, with being able to handle sensory input and all these different kind of things. She wrote a book that's called Thinking in Pictures. And in her book, one of the things she talks about is that people on the autism spectrum are most frequently visual learners. And by using visual supports, they're going to be, that she needs those visual supports. She doesn't think when people tell her things or she's putting information, she doesn't see words or hear the words. She has visual pictures in her mind to help her remember things. And we can use visual strategies to try to help kids that we work with be more successful in processing information as well. As we said, kids with autism spectrum disorders are usually visual learners. They're not responsive to auditory cues. They have difficulty with the words coming in. And they're often also very sensitive to sound. When you put those three things together, the visual strategies that we can use play to students' strengths and minimize their auditory difficulties.